We close our study of the Milesian School with Anaximenes, the third of the great Ionian thinkers. A pupil of Anaximander, Anaximenes returned in a sense to the intuition of Thales. The principle should be something concrete, something we encounter in the natural world. But he did not choose water. He chose air, and he took a step neither Thales nor Anaximander had taken. He explained the mechanism by which this single principle transforms itself into the multiplicity of things. That mechanism was condensation and rarefaction. With Anaximenes, Milesian philosophy reaches a degree of systematic coherence without precedent. In this lesson we shall examine just what air is as a principle, how it transforms, and why his thought marks the culmination of the first philosophical school in the West. The Milesian School had taken two decisive steps. Thales had proposed that everything comes from water. Anaximander had answered that the principle must be something indefinite, beyond any concrete element. But one question remained unasked, and Anaximenes was the first to pose it clearly. How does change actually happen? If everything arises from a single source, by what process does that unity become the multiplicity we see around us? Pointing to the origin is not enough. The mechanism must be explained. The problem has two faces. The first is physical. What concrete process can make a single substance take on forms as different as fire, wind, cloud, water, and stone? The second is metaphysical. Anaximander had solved the difficulty by positing the indefinite, but at a price. His principle was so abstract that its link to concrete things became hard to grasp. Anaximenes wanted to preserve Thales's intuition. The principle must be something real, something tangible. While also meeting Anaximander's demand, the principle must account for change. His solution was as elegant as it was bold. The principle is air, and change occurs through condensation and rarefaction. For the first time in the history of thought, someone was offering an explanation of becoming itself. As with all the Presocratics, reconstructing the thought of Anaximenes means working from second-hand reports. Aristotle mentions him, but with extreme economy. A few lines in the Metaphysics and on the Heavens are all we have from the philosopher. He acknowledges Anaximenes as the last of the Milesians but does not pause to expound his system in any detail. The fullest transmission comes, once again, from Theophrastus. His lost work, The Opinions of the Natural Philosophers, contained a summary of Anaximenes' doctrine that we know through later doxographers. Chief among these are Simplicius, who in his commentary on Aristotle's physics preserves the one surviving verbatim fragment, and Hippolytus, whose first book of the Refutation of All Heresies provides an especially valuable summary of Anaximenes' cosmology. Aetius, in his Opinions of the Philosophers, adds further details. The difficulty, as ever with the Presocratics, is distance. Between Anaximenes and ourselves stand at least 3 layers of transmission. What we read is an echo, not the original voice. Anaximenes was the third and last of the great Milesian thinkers. Tradition places him as the pupil or immediate successor of Anaximander, active in the same city and the same century. Miletus remained a commercial and cultural crossroads, open to the traffic of goods and ideas. But something had begun to shift. During Anaximenes' lifetime, the Persian Empire was extending its dominion over the Greek cities of Asia Minor. Miletus, which had flourished as an independent polis, was moving toward its political twilight. In 494 BCE, not long after the philosopher's death, the city would be razed by the Persians after a failed revolt. Anaximenes wrote, then, at a moment of intellectual fullness and gathering historical threat. With him, the Milesian school reached its mature form. If Thales had named the principle, and Anaximander had pushed it beyond the visible, Anaximenes completed the triad by explaining the mechanism of change. After him, the center of gravity of philosophy would shift to other cities, Ephesus, Colophon, Elea, Athens. But the founding gesture was complete. Milesian philosophy had already posed the questions that would mark the centuries to come. What is the world made of? How does it change? What lies beneath the multiplicity we see? Anaximenes was the last to answer them from Miletus. We have reached the doctrinal center of Anaximenes' thought. We possess from him a single verbatim sentence, transmitted by Simplicius in his commentary on Aristotle's Physics. It is a fragment of extreme brevity, yet of extraordinary depth. It runs, "Just as our soul, being air, holds us together, so too a breath and an air encompass the whole world." In these few words is encoded not only Anaximenes' cosmology, but an intuition that will run through centuries of Western thought. What this fragment contains is the first documented formulation of an analogy between the human being and the universe, what would later be called microcosm and macrocosm. Our soul, says Anaximenes, is air. It is breath that keeps us alive, that gives unity and cohesion to our body. When we breathe in, we take in air, when we breathe out, we return it. And the very same principle that sustains us from within also envelops the cosmos from without. The whole world breathes. Air is not merely one element among others. It is the vital principle of everything that exists, the force that unifies the diversity of things. Why air, and not water or the indefinite? Anaximenes found in air what his predecessors had not managed to combine, a principle that was at once concrete and boundless. Like Thales' water, air is something we can feel. But unlike water, air is invisible, subtle, seemingly without limits. And most importantly, air transforms before our eyes. As it condenses, it becomes cloud, then water, then earth, then stone. As it rarefies, it becomes fire. Anaximenes does more than name a principle. He explains how it works. For the first time, becoming has a mechanism. That mechanism is condensation and rarefaction, two processes Anaximenes drew from everyday observation. When we purse our lips and blow, the air exits compressed and we feel it as cold. When we blow with an open mouth, the air expands and we feel it as warm. Cold is condensing air, heat is rarefying air. From this simple experience, Anaximenes extracted a universal law. Condensation cools and compacts. Rarefaction heats and expands. Fire, wind, cloud, water, earth, stone, all are merely different degrees of density of one and the same principle. The one becomes many through a continuous and observable process. With Anaximenes, Milesian philosophy reaches its most complete expression. Anaximenes did not simply declare air to be the principle. Like any genuine philosopher, he gave reasons for his choice and explained the mechanism by which a single principle transforms into the multiplicity of things. His arguments are not abstract deductions. They are invitations to observe the world with care. Let us examine the three main grounds that support his doctrine. The first ground appeals to the most immediate experience. Air transforms before our eyes. When the sky darkens, we see air condensing into clouds. From those clouds rain falls, which is water. That water soaks the earth and compacts it. At the other extreme, warm air rises, rarefies, and approaches the nature of fire. No other element, not water, not earth, not fire, displays such observable plasticity in the ordinary course of nature. Air, and air alone, allows us to explain change without having to posit a mysterious, inaccessible principle like Anaximenes' apeiron. Transformation is not a metaphysical riddle. It happens in front of us, every day. The second ground is the deepest and most original in Anaximenes. It comes directly from the surviving fragment and constitutes the first documented analogy between the human being and the universe. Our soul, says Anaximenes, is air. It is breath that keeps us alive, that holds our limbs together, that governs us from within. When we breathe in, we take in the principle that sustains us. When we breathe out, we return it to the world. What the soul does for the body, air does for the entire cosmos. The world is not a lifeless machine. It is a breathing organism, enveloped and steered by an infinite breath. The human microcosm and the universal macrocosm are woven from the same substance and governed by the same principle. The third ground is of an almost experimental simplicity. Anaximenes invites his listeners to perform a test with their own bodies. Purse your lips and blow. The air exits compressed and feels cold against your hand. Open your mouth wide and exhale. The air expands and feels warm. This experience, available to anyone, reveals the two forces that govern the cosmos. Condensation cools and compacts. Thus air becomes cloud, water, earth, stone. Rarefaction heats and expands. Thus air becomes fire. Condensation and rarefaction are not abstract concepts. They are processes anyone can verify in their own body, here and now. With this argument, Anaximenes turns philosophy away from speculation about the invisible and roots it in common experience. To propose air as the principle and condensation as the mechanism was not an isolated gesture. It set in motion consequences that reshaped the image of the cosmos, the understanding of change, and the very conception of the divine. Let us examine the fundamental consequences of Anaximenes' doctrine. The first consequence is cosmological. If everything arises from air through condensation and rarefaction, then the cosmos is a dynamic continuum. There are no rigid boundaries between the elements. Fire, air, wind, cloud, water, earth, and stone are not separate realities but different degrees of density of one and the same substance. Between the solidest stone and the most subtle fire there is an uninterrupted gradation. Nature makes no leaps. It transforms gradually. The earth itself, Anaximenes held, floats upon air like a leaf upon the breath. It needs no material support, for air, being infinite, sustains it without effort. Anaximenes' cosmos is an integrated whole, without fissures or unfathomable mysteries. The second consequence is metaphysical. With Anaximenes, change is explained without recourse to the indefinite. Anaximander had solved the problem of opposing elements by positing a quality-less principle, but at the cost of making it inaccessible to experience. Anaximenes found a more elegant solution. The principle is something concrete, air, which we can feel and breathe, and at the same time it is capable of generating the full diversity of reality through its plasticity. The one and the many are reconciled in a continuous, observable process. The third consequence concerns the divine. Anaximenes stated, according to the surviving testimonies, that the gods themselves arise from air. They are not the creators of the cosmos but products of the same principle that generates all things. The divine is not outside the world, nor does it transcend it. It is integrated into nature, subject to the same laws of condensation and rarefaction that govern everything else. It is one further step in the depersonalization of the sacred that Thales had begun. We arrive thus at the fourth consequence, which is at once a closure and an opening. With Anaximenes, the Milesian School reaches its culmination. In 3 generations, 3 thinkers had transformed the history of thought forever. Thales had identified the principle as something natural, not divine. Anaximander had pushed it beyond the visible, into the terrain of abstraction. Anaximenes had completed the triad by explaining the mechanism of change. The fundamental questions: what is the world made of? How does it change? What lies beneath the multiplicity we see, had been posed. And a method had been established. Observe nature attentively and give reasons. Milesian philosophy was ending, but philosophy, simply, had just begun. Interpreting Anaximenes involves confronting difficulties that have occupied scholars for generations. The first concerns the very nature of air. Are we dealing with a material principle in the physical sense, a gas, a substance, or with something closer to a biological intuition? Breath as the vital principle? The surviving fragment, with its analogy between soul and cosmos, suggests that these two readings need not exclude one another, but the debate persists. The second question bears on the originality of his doctrine. Does Anaximenes represent an advance over Anaximander, by supplying a mechanism for change, or a retreat, by returning to a determinate principle after the bold abstraction of the apeiron? The third question probes the reasons for his choice. Why air in particular? Anaximenes may have relied exclusively on the observations we have already discussed. But it is equally possible that he drew upon Near Eastern cosmogonies in which breath or wind figure as creative principles. The fourth question is broader. Is Anaximenes a systematic thinker, who built a unified theory of the cosmos, or an ingenious observer who gathered scattered insights without welding them into a system? The scantiness of the evidence prevents a conclusive answer, and both views likely contain something of the truth. The assessment of Anaximenes has shifted markedly among historians of philosophy. Werner Jaeger, in his monumental Paideia, saw him as the thinker who brought the Milesian school to its culmination. With Anaximenes, the purely natural explanation of the cosmos reaches its fullest form: an observable principle, a verifiable mechanism, an analogy that connects the human being to the universe. For Jaeger, Anaximenes is the link that completes the chain begun by Thales. Geoffrey Kirk, at the opposite extreme, urged deliberate caution. The testimonies, he insisted, are simply too fragmentary to support the image of a grand systematic thinker. Anaximenes was an astute observer, certainly, but elevating his insights to the status of a system goes beyond what the sources permit. Jonathan Barnes, for his part, has defended a more generous reading. In his view, the doctrine of condensation and rarefaction marks a turning point in the history of thought. It is the first scientific explanation of change, the first time someone proposed a concrete mechanism to answer the question of how the one becomes many. Three scholars, three very different Anaximenes. We have reached the end of our lesson on Anaximenes, and with it, the close of our journey through the Milesian School. 3 points deserve to be held onto. The first is his proposal of air as archê. Against the abstraction of Anaximander, Anaximenes returned to a principle that is concrete and observable. But this was no retreat. Air is at once tangible and boundless, material and subtle. And above all, it transforms before our eyes. Anaximenes did not simply name the principle. He chose it because it could explain change. The second point is precisely that, the mechanism of change. For the first time in the history of thought, someone offered an explanation of becoming. Condensation and rarefaction are not metaphors or abstract concepts. They are processes anyone can verify. Purse your lips and blow. The air exits cold and compressed. Open your mouth and exhale. The air exits warm and expanded. From that everyday experience, Anaximenes drew a universal law. Fire, wind, cloud, water, earth, and stone are merely degrees of density of one and the same substance. The one becomes many through a continuous and observable process. The third point is that with Anaximenes the Milesian school reaches its culmination. 3 thinkers, across 3 generations, had transformed the history of thought forever. Thales had identified the principle as something natural, not divine. Anaximander had pushed it beyond the visible. Anaximenes had explained how it works. The fundamental questions, what is the world made of? How does it change? Had been posed. And a method had been established. Look at nature with care and give reasons. That is why we close with this thought. Anaximenes did not only say what the world is made of. He explained how it transforms. And in doing so, he completed the gesture Thales began and Anaximander deepened. Milesian philosophy was ending. Philosophy, simply, had just begun. For those wishing to pursue Anaximenes and the Presocratics further, several works are indispensable. The standard critical edition of the fragments remains Deals and Kranz's Presocratic Fragments, which collects all surviving testimonia in their original languages. As for secondary literature, the collaborative volume by Kirk, Raven, and Schofield, The Presocratic Philosophers, remains the essential guide. Alongside it stand Jonathan Barnes's meticulous early Greek philosophy, Werner Jaeger's monumental Paideia, which situates Anaximenes as the culmination of Milesian philosophy, and the first volume of Guthrie's History of Greek Philosophy, which offers an extensive and nuanced treatment of the Ionian thinkers. In our next lesson we shall leave Miletus behind and enter a very different philosophical tradition, the Pythagorean school, where the principle will no longer be a material element, but number. I hope you will join us there. Thank you for your attention. Until next time.